The cold came early to Millfield that November. Not the polite cold of late October that people accept as seasonal and reasonable, but the kind that bites, that turns the brick storefronts along Hartley Street the color of old slate and drives everyone indoors by 7 in the evening. By the second week of November, the elm trees along Crescent Avenue had given up the last of their leaves entirely, and the sidewalks were matted with them, wet and dark, pressing into the cracks between the cement squares in a way that would not change until spring decided to come back. The sky on most mornings was the flat, continuous gray that meteorologists classify as stratus coverage, and that the people of Millfield simply called the November sky, the sky that meant you wore your coat and did not expect the sun. Rosie Baxter was 7 years old that November, and she was the kind of child that adults tended to notice without quite being able to say why. She was not loud. She was not particularly large for her age. She had her mother's dark brown eyes and her grandmother's habit of tilting her head slightly to the right when she was thinking through a problem, and she wore her hair in 2 braids that her mother redid every morning before the first shift started, which meant by 3:30 in the afternoon they had usually come half undone in the particular way braids come undone on children who move through their days with full commitment. She attended 2nd grade at Millfield Elementary on the corner of Whitmore and Bay Streets, 3 blocks from the apartment she shared with her mother, Clara, on the 2nd floor of a yellow brick building that had been a decent address 30 years ago and was now simply an affordable one. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her teacher was Mrs. Patricia Hammond, who had been teaching 2nd grade for 22 years and who had told Clara Baxter at the October parent conference that Rosie was one of those children who absorbed everything without appearing to, who could be trusted to do the right thing when no one was watching. Clara had nodded and driven home that evening and sat in the parking lot of the building for a few minutes before going upstairs, holding what the teacher had said in the particular way that mothers hold things that confirm what they most hope is true about their children. Clara Baxter was 34 years old and had been working at St. Agatha's Hospital cafeteria for 2.5 years. Before that she had worked register at the Dumont Grocery on 5th Street, and before that she had spent 18 months as a receptionist at a dental office that closed without warning when the owner's financial difficulties caught up with him, and he simply did not unlock the door one Thursday morning in July. Each of those jobs had paid slightly less than the one before it, which was not the direction a person wanted things to go when they had a child and a fixed address and no backup. Rosie's father, Marcus Baxter, had been gone for 3 years, since Rosie was 4. His departure had left more practical wreckage than emotional damage, which was its own particular difficulty. He had taken the car, left behind 17 months of credit card debt in both their names, and moved to Phoenix without a forwarding address. Clara had spent the first year untangling the financial residue of that decision with the focused exhaustion of someone who understood that there was no option except to keep going. She was still untangling some of it. The apartment on Crescent and Dunn was $850 a month. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that looked out onto the alley, and a living room where Rosie did her homework at the small table by the radiator because the light was better there than anywhere else. The building's heat ran inconsistently in the mornings, which had led Clara to buy Rosie a good coat in September, a red wool coat from the discount department store on Main Street, $47. Thicker than necessary for October, exactly right for what November and December were going to require. That coat was important. Clara had spent a specific and careful amount of money on it and had brought it home on a Saturday and hung it on the hook by the door and told Rosie, without elaborating further, to take care of it. Rosie understood what that meant. In 7 years, she had developed a precise sense of the difference between things that could be replaced without difficulty and things that could not. On Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, Clara worked a double shift that ran from 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, then a second from 4 to close at 8:30, with a 30-minute break in between. During those breaks, she sat in the staff room with a cup of coffee and ate the lunch she had packed at 5:45 that morning and thought about Rosie. She could not call during service, so she thought instead, running through the route and the timing and the things that needed to happen in the correct sequence for the evening to go the way it was supposed to go. The after-school program in the gymnasium ran until 5:30, supervised by Mrs. Dorothea Finch, a retired art teacher who was 71, and who kept a tin of hard candies on her desk and told the children every single afternoon that patience was a muscle, and they were all building it whether they liked it or not. At 5:30, when the gymnasium closed, Clara could not be there. Her second shift ran until 8:30, and the walk home from Millfield Elementary to the apartment on Crescent and Dunn was 11 minutes at a normal pace, 8 if Rosie moved quickly, 14 if she stopped at the bus shelter on Hartley Street. Rosie had a key on a yellow lanyard around her neck. Clara had walked the route with her a dozen times before she allowed it, had timed it at different hours and in different weather, had spoken with Mrs. Finch about the arrangement and with their neighbor on the third floor, Mrs. Alvarez, who was retired and home by 4 and had agreed to be reachable by phone if Rosie ever needed anything. The building's front door required a code. Clara had reviewed every piece of it in the careful, systematic way of a mother who has no backup plan and cannot afford to improvise. Still, on every double-shift night, at some point between 4 and 5:30, Clara stood at the cafeteria steam table or the salad station and thought about the walk and the key and the lanyard in Rosie's face when she got it right. The Tuesday that matters in this story was November the 14th. A gray day. The sky had been flat and continuous since morning, the straightest layer sitting low over the city, and the temperature at 3:30 in the afternoon was 29 degrees with a wind that added 10 more degrees of damage to that number. By the time Millfield Elementary released its children, the sidewalks around Whitmore Street were briefly full of noise and then, in the way of cold afternoons, went quiet again quickly as everyone moved toward somewhere warm. Rosie left the after-school program at 5:28. She remembered the time because the clock above the gymnasium door ran slightly slow and Mrs. Finch had asked her that afternoon to check it against her own watch. The watch was digital, yellow band, a birthday present from her grandmother in September, and she wore it on her left wrist and checked it often the way children who are given their first watch always do, with a proprietary satisfaction in the ability to know the time without asking anyone else. The clock on the wall said 5:20. Her watch said 5:28. Mrs. Finch shook her head and reached for the step stool. Rosie zipped her coat and went out the side door into the late afternoon. She walked with her backpack on both shoulders, which was how her mother had told her to carry it so the weight was even and she could move at a proper pace. She knew the route by now the way you know a thing you have done many times, without needing to think about the individual steps. Left on Whitmore, right on Hartley, past the pharmacy and the coin laundry and the bus shelter on the corner. Right on Crescent, yellow brick building, code at the door, second floor, key. Hartley Street was quiet that Tuesday. The coin laundry had its lights on behind the glass, orange and warm. The pharmacy was open, its sign casting a faint glow onto the wet sidewalk. 2 people stood outside the dry cleaners having a conversation in the brisk, abbreviated way of people finishing a conversation in cold weather. The air had the particular quality that experienced Midwesterners recognize as the hours before a change in weather, a dryness and stillness that says snow is coming, not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. She would have walked straight past the bus shelter on Hartley. Except there was an old man sitting on the bench inside it who was shivering so badly she could see it from the sidewalk. She stopped. He was elderly, 70 or so she guessed, though she did not yet have the vocabulary to estimate ages with precision. He was tall even seated, with a broad frame that suggested he had been larger at an earlier point in his life, and he wore a gray wool sweater over a collared shirt, dark trousers, and dress shoes that were not appropriate for the weather. No coat, no hat, no gloves. His hands were pressed together between his knees and his shoulders were drawn up toward his ears in the involuntary posture of someone whose body is trying to reduce its surface area against the cold. He was not dramatic about it. He was not performing his discomfort. He was simply sitting there in the cold, shivering with his eyes on the street. Rosie stood on the sidewalk and looked at him. Her mother had given her specific, careful instructions about strangers. Do not get into cars with people you do not know. Do not go anywhere alone with an adult you have not met before. If something feels wrong, walk quickly toward the nearest open business and ask for help. Clara had reviewed these instructions more than once, updating them as Rosie's world expanded, checking her comprehension the way a careful teacher checks comprehension, not assuming but verifying. Her mother had also taught her something else. Not informal instructions, but through her own behavior, which Rosie had been watching with the close attention that children give to the adults they most depend on. She had watched Clara pack an extra portion of her lunch and leave it with the man who slept in the doorway on 3rd Street on cold mornings. She had watched her stop and give careful directions to people who looked lost. She had watched her drive 20 minutes out of her way last winter to take Mrs. Alvarez to a medical appointment because the bus route had been suspended and Mrs. Alvarez was 78 and did not drive. Clara had never called any of this kindness. She had simply done it. And Rosie had watched. She walked up to the bus shelter. "Hello," she said. The old man looked up. His eyes were pale gray, the color of the November sky, and they were entirely clear and alert. Whatever his body was doing in the cold, his mind was not confused. He looked at her the way a person looks at something unexpected, with the attention of someone deciding what to make of it. "Hello, young lady," he said. His voice was low and even the voice of someone who had given instructions for a long time and had learned to make them sound like conversation. "Are you waiting for the bus?" He considered this as though it were a more complicated question than it appeared. "I was," he said. "I believe I may have missed it. The 34 runs every 20 minutes. She had learned this over months of walking past this shelter and paying attention to the patterns of things. "You have about 16 minutes until the next one." He looked at her with an expression she would later describe to her mother as the kind where you can tell someone didn't expect what you said. Something between surprise and a kind of paying attention. "You know the schedule," he said. "I walk this way home every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday," she said, "and some Fridays." She was still on the sidewalk, still at the appropriate distance. But she was looking at his hands, pressed together between his knees, and at the gray sweater doing nothing against 29 degrees, and at the slight working of his jaw, the way jaws work when the muscles in them are fighting the cold. She had a coat on. A good one. $47. Warm. She took it off. He watched her do this with an expression that shifted from surprise to something more complicated. "What are you doing?" he said. "You're cold," Rosie said. She walked to the shelter entrance and held the coat out with both hands. "It's warm. You can use it until the bus comes." He did not take it immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that takes in more than it appears to, and then he looked at the coat. It was a child's coat, red, meant for someone a third of his size. But she was holding it out with the serious, matter-of-fact expression of a person offering a tool that is needed for a specific job. "I cannot take your coat, young lady," he said. "I'm almost home." She gestured down the street toward Crescent Avenue. "5 more minutes. You still have 16 minutes to wait." He looked at the coat and then at her and then back at the coat. Something moved through his expression that she was too young to fully name, but that she recognized as the way people's faces changed when something mattered to them and they were deciding what to do about it. He took the coat. He held it across his lap, not putting it on, just holding it, and looked down at it for a moment. "Sit down if you like," he said. "You don't have to stand in the cold." She was cold now without the coat, the wind reaching her through her sweater. Without exactly deciding, she sat down on the bench a few feet from him, leaving the space her mother had taught her to keep with people she did not know, and put her arms across her chest the way she had seen Arthur sitting when she first noticed him. They sat in quiet for a moment. He was looking at the street. She was looking at her watch. "What is your name?" he asked. "Rosie." She looked at him. "What's yours?" "Arthur," he said. And then, after a pause, as if deciding whether to include this, "Whitfield." She nodded. 7-year-olds nod when the information has been received, even if it doesn't yet mean anything in particular. "I'm waiting for my mom," she said. "She works late on Tuesdays." "What does she do?" "She works at St. Agatha's Hospital. The cafeteria. She makes food for the people there." He looked at her steadily. "That is important work." He said it without condescension, simply as a fact being placed where it belonged. She received it the same way. "I know," she said. "She gets up really early to be there when it opens." They sat for another moment. "Do you have children?" she asked. "I have 2, he said. "A son and a daughter." "Do they live here?" "My daughter lives in Seattle with her family. My son lives here in Millfield. He works with me." "What do you do?" He looked at the street with the expression of someone choosing which part of a longer answer to give. "I run a company," he said. "What kind?" He was quiet for a beat. "We build things," he said. "And we own things." He paused. "That is the short version. The longer version takes considerably more time." She considered this. My mom's boss owns the cafeteria company. He has a car with a driver too. Arthur looked at her sideways. There was something in the look, a slight adjustment, a recalibration. How do you know that? She mentioned it when she was telling me about her job when she first started. Her boss came in once. She said he had a car waiting outside. He was quiet for a moment. Do you pay attention to everything? I pay attention to things that tell me how things work, she said. He turned to look at her with the full directness of his gray eyes. She looked back at him with equal steadiness. This was the moment, though neither of them knew it yet, that something shifted between them from the ordinary transaction of two strangers sharing a bench against the cold into something more substantial. Why don't you have a coat? She asked. He looked out at the street again. I went for a walk this afternoon and I left it in the car, he said. I didn't expect to walk as far as I did. Where's your car? His jaw moved slightly. My driver went to find parking. We had a miscommunication about where I intended to go. She processed this. He had a driver. Her mom's boss had a driver. Arthur ran a company that built things and owned things. She filed this information in the same orderly way she filed most information, without attaching a judgment to it, simply noting it. Is he coming back? She asked. Yes. He will have worked out by now that I walked further than planned. He paused. He is probably extremely annoyed with me. He said this without apparent distress, the tone of a person describing an inconvenience they were accustomed to navigating. Do you walk a lot? She asked. Recently, yes. He looked briefly in her direction. My doctor told me I should. Is it helping? He was quiet for a moment. I think so. I had forgotten some things. He looked back at the street. Walking helps me remember them. What kind of things? He thought about this with the same seriousness she gave to questions she asked, not deflecting it because it came from a child. What things are worth paying attention to, he said. You stop noticing after a long time of working. The things that are real. My grandma says something like that. She says my mom works too hard and doesn't look at anything. What does your mother say? She says she'll look at things when things are less hard. Rosie paused. My grandma says that's not how it works. She says you have to practice looking when things are hard or you forget how when they get easier. Arthur Whitfield looked at her. He held what she had said for a moment in the careful way you hold something fragile. Your grandmother sounds like a very intelligent woman, he said. She's in Cleveland. We go at Christmas. She makes pierogi. Something at the edge of his mouth shifted in the direction of a smile. He held it back, but not entirely. Do you help her make them? I need the dough, Rosie said. She says I'm getting better. Last year I went too hard and she had to redo my section. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same territory. One of his hands, which had been pressed between his knees, moved to rest on the coat in his lap, and the fingers moved slightly against the red wool, a small and possibly unconscious gesture. You said you know the bus schedule, he said after a moment. The 34 and the 12A, she said. The 7 doesn't stop here. It goes on Whitmore. He tilted his head. And you learned all of that just from walking past. I walk past 3 times a week and I notice the buses, she said. He looked at her with the attention of a person who has encountered something they were not expecting and has decided to give it their full consideration. How long have you been walking this route alone? Since the 3rd week of September. She was precise about this. My mom walked it with me a lot first. We did it at different times of day. She timed it. He nodded slowly. But she works late. 3 days a week. That is a significant responsibility for someone your age. She looked at him directly. I'm 7. I know, he said, receiving the information with gravity. 7 is significant. My mom says she lets me do it because she trusts me. She said it's not because it's easy. It's because she trusts me. Rosie was quiet for a second. Those are different things. Arthur Whitfield looked at her for a long time. She returned his gaze without self-consciousness. The way children who have been spoken to as full people by the adults in their lives are capable of meeting an adult's attention without flinching. Yes, he said at last. Those are different things. She told him about the weather project in school, the stratus clouds and the cirrus clouds and the difference between fog and low cloud cover, which was actually nothing, they were the same thing. She had found this interesting when Mrs. Hammond explained it. She told him about her grandmother's pierogi, the potato and cheese filling and the amount of kneading involved and the way her grandmother let her do the shaping even when they came out uneven. She told him that her mother could whistle any song she heard by ear, and that Rosie had been trying to learn for 2 months with no meaningful results. He listened. He did not half listen, the way adults sometimes did when children talked, one part of their attention on the child and another part on whatever mattered more. He listened with the concentrated attention of a person who had been doing something differently for a long time and had recently stopped, who was practicing something he had almost forgotten. He told her, when she asked, that he had grown up in Millfield, that downtown had been different when he was young, 3 department stores and a cinema, that his father had worked at a manufacturing plant on the east side, a plant that was gone now, closed before she was born, that his mother had made a chicken soup he had never found in any restaurant that came anywhere near it. She tilted her head. Your last name is Whitfield and there was a Whitfield manufacturing plant? He looked at her. Yes. Was it your dad's company? My grandfather started it, he said. My father ran it after that. He paused. I took the company in a different direction when it became mine. She considered this. That must have been hard, she said. Changing something your grandpa made. He was quiet for a moment. Harder than I understood at the time, he said. The 34 came at 5:47, 1 minute before schedule. Rosie checked her watch and noted this with the mild indignation of someone for whom a deviation from a known pattern was worth acknowledging. Arthur stood slowly, the deliberate stiffness of a large man who had been sitting in cold air for 20 minutes, and he reached down and held the red coat out to her. Thank you, he said. Not quickly, not as a formality. He held it for a second before she took it, as though the word needed that extra moment to carry what he intended it to carry. She took the coat and put it on and zipped it to the top. The inside was warm where he had been holding it. Have a nice Christmas in Cleveland, she told him. He looked at her. Something in his face had the quality she had seen in it when she first offered the coat, the quality of a person deciding what to do about something that had just mattered to him. I will try, he said. He paused. Thank you, Rosie. He stepped onto the bus. The doors closed. The 34 pulled away from the curb and moved down Hartley Street. She watched it go, then turned and walked the last block and a half to Crescent Avenue. The wind was stronger now, the cold more present, but the walk was short and the coat was warm, and she moved at the right pace with the key ready in her hand before she reached the door. She was inside and upstairs with her homework open on the table by the radiator before 5:54. She noted this with the same quiet satisfaction she gave to most things that went according to plan. She did not think of what had happened as unusual. Person had been cold. She had a coat. The math of that was straightforward. But 50 yards down Hartley Street, parked in a gray sedan with the engine running and the heat on low, a man named Thomas Reed had been watching from the moment Rosie Baxter stopped on the sidewalk outside the bus shelter. Thomas was 63 years old. He had driven for Arthur Whitfield for 17 years, which meant he had been present for the full arc of the company's most significant period of growth, for the year Jean Whitfield was sick, for the reorganization that followed her death, for the ECG results from 6 months ago that had changed the tenor of Arthur's days. In 17 years he had seen Arthur Whitfield in boardrooms and courtrooms and hospital waiting rooms. He had seen him at the height of his authority and in the worst hours of his grief. He had never seen anything quite like what he was watching right now. He watched the child take off her coat. He watched her hold it out with both hands. He watched Arthur hold it folded on his lap for 16 minutes while the two of them sat in the bus shelter and talked, the back and forth of two people having a real conversation, not the careful managed brevity Arthur had brought to most of his interactions with strangers since Jean died. He watched Arthur smile, which Thomas noted with the particular attention of someone for whom that was no longer an everyday sight. He watched Rosie take her coat back, button it to the top, and walk away down Crescent Avenue with her backpack on both shoulders and her pace quick and purposeful until she turned the corner and was gone. Thomas sat in the gray sedan for a moment after the 34 had taken Arthur away and the street had gone quiet again. He drummed his fingers once on the steering wheel. Then he reached into the center console and pulled out the small notebook he had carried since his first week working for Arthur Whitfield, the one in which he kept notes about things he thought were worth remembering. He wrote down the date, November 14th. He wrote the time. 5:28 to 5:47. He wrote, Hartley Street, bus shelter, corner of Coin Laundry. Girl, approximately 7, red coat, yellow backpack, walks from direction of Whitmore. Turned onto Crescent Avenue. Mother works cafeteria, St. Agatha's Hospital. He underlined St. Agatha's twice. Then he closed the notebook and pulled out into traffic to meet Arthur at the next stop on Alderman Street. When he pulled up and opened the rear door, Arthur got in and settled into the back seat. He looked out the window at the Millfield streets moving past. He did not speak for a long time, which was not unusual, but the quality of the silence was different. Thomas could read the quality of Arthur's silences the way a person reads weather, and this one was not the silence of a man who was done thinking for the day. This was the silence of a man who had just started. "Are you all right, sir?" Thomas asked. Arthur continued looking out the window. "More than I was this morning," he said. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror and said nothing further. He drove. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Arthur Whitfield had come back to Millfield 3 months earlier. Not because he had planned to, not in the way his major decisions were usually planned, with projections and structural analyses and input from the people on his team whose job it was to evaluate what made sense. He had come back because his cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Nair, had sat across from him after his second ECG in 6 months and told him with the directness she brought to every conversation that the pace he had maintained for 43 years had taken something from him that was not going to come back unless he stopped. She had not said retire. She had said restructure. Delegate the things other people can handle. Find something that is not the company. She said it without softening it because that was not how she worked, and Arthur had listened with the careful attention he brought to all information that was accurate, and had known she was right because he had been knowing she was right for approximately 3 years before that appointment and had been doing nothing about it. The company was Whitfield Capital Holdings. His grandfather, Edward Whitfield, had started a manufacturing concern in Millfield in 1938, building specialized components for the automotive industry that were used in plants across the Midwest for 40 years. Arthur's father, Richard, had recognized in the 1970s that the manufacturing era in cities like Millfield was ending and had shifted the company into real estate development and property management. When Richard retired and Arthur took over, he had expanded further into commercial development, financial services, 14 states. The company held assets of approximately $4 billion and employed just under 2,000 people directly, with several thousand more through contractors and subsidiary operations. Arthur knew the employee number the way you know a number you have been responsible for across decades, concretely, personally, with the weight of what it represents sitting behind every decision you make. He had a daughter, Caroline, 42, who lived in Seattle with her husband and their 2 children, James, 11, and Nora, 8. He had a son, Edward, named for his grandfather, 37, who worked in commercial development with the methodical, precise competence he had inherited from Richard Whitfield and which Arthur had always trusted more than he had ever said adequately out loud. His wife, Jean, had died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, discovered in August of the year she was 63, gone by the following February. 6 months. Arthur had run the company through all of it, which was partly genuine necessity and partly the only mechanism he had for staying functional, and which Dr. Nair had identified without equivocation as one of the things that had cost him. Jean had known it was costing him. She had said so, in the careful way she said things she needed him to hear, not angry, not resigned, simply accurate. He had told her she was right and had gone back to work the following morning and had continued going back to work every morning since, for 4 years, until the second ECG changed the terms of the conversation. He had bought a house in Millfield, the old Harrington property on Maple Drive, large and private, with a garden in the back that reminded him of the garden Jean had kept at their house in Connecticut, the one she had tended every spring and summer with the focused devotion of someone who understood that growing things was not decorative but essential. The Connecticut garden had stopped being maintained the fall she got sick. Arthur had not been able to bring himself to hire anyone to continue it, and it had gone wild and then gone dormant and now showed only what was toughest and most persistent, which was something but not what it had been. He had started walking on Dr. Nair's instruction. Tuesday afternoons, 45 minutes minimum, no phone calls, no briefings, just walking. He had agreed because there was no productive argument against it, and he had discovered in the first 3 weeks that it was doing something he had not anticipated. It was making him remember how to see things. He had found Hartley Street on his second walk and recognized it not as a specific place he remembered from childhood but as a specific quality of place, the kind with the coin laundry and the bus shelter and the dollar store, the kind that was full of the ordinary life of people who could not afford to live anywhere else. He had stood in front of it for a long time. He had grown up on the east side of Millfield, 3 streets over from where this part of the city sat. His grandfather had lived among the people who worked his plant. His father had moved the family to the west side when the business expanded, which was the direction things moved in Millfield when money arrived. Arthur had been 12 when they moved. He had watched the east side become something that was discussed in certain rooms in certain tones, the way places become discussed when the people with the power to change them have moved away and decided the distance is normal. He had thought about this during his walks. He had thought about it tonight on the bus, with the red coat warming in his hands before he gave it back. A 7-year-old girl had taken off her only coat and held it out to a stranger in the cold. She had not done it because anyone was watching. She had not done it because she expected anything in return. She had done it because the math was obvious to her, because she had been taught, by someone who could not always afford the luxury of kindness and practiced it anyway, that this was simply what you did. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the Harrington house now, a glass of water in front of him and a legal pad he had pulled from the desk in the study. Outside, the November dark had settled over Maple Drive and the temperature had dropped further, the sky clearing partially to show the stars between the cloud gaps. He had not written on a legal pad in this way in a very long time. The writing he did for work was different, strategic, designed to produce a specific outcome. This was different. He was writing toward something he had not fully found yet. He wrote, "What are you actually doing here?" He sat with that for a while. He wrote, "What would it mean to actually come back?" He sat with that longer. He thought about his grandfather, who had started a manufacturing concern in 1938 in a city he had been born in and had known completely, who had known the streets and the families and the names of the people who needed work. The company had traveled very far from that specific knowledge, and Arthur had not, until these past 3 months of walking, examined clearly whether the distance was an achievement or a cost, or whether it was both at once, which was what most things were if you looked at them honestly. He thought about the girl's grandmother in Cleveland who said you had to practice looking at things when they were hard, or you forgot how when they got easier. He thought about Caroline in Seattle, who had brought James and Nora to Jean's memorial 4 years ago and who had not been back. He thought about Nora, who had been 4 years old at the memorial and had climbed into his lap with complete confidence and put her small hand on his cheek with the direct tenderness that only very young children and very old friendships can produce. He had held her for a long time. He had not seen her since. There had always been something. A board meeting, a development project, a crisis in the financial services division, the accumulated gravity of the company pulling everything toward itself. There was always something. He thought about James and Nora. He thought about what it meant that an 8-year-old girl he had never met had sat with him in a bus shelter for 16 minutes and talked to him with more genuine attention than he had experienced in a single conversation in 4 years of carefully managed professional interactions. He thought about St. Agatha's Hospital cafeteria, about a woman who worked double shifts and got up at 5:45 in the morning and packed an extra portion of her lunch to leave with the man who slept in the doorway on 3rd Street, and who had somehow, in the middle of all of that, raised a daughter who took off her coat without hesitation when someone needed it. He wrote on the legal pad, "Find out what the cafeteria workers at St. Agatha's are paid." He looked at what he had written. He wrote, "Find out what it would take to do something about it." He sat with his water and the legal pad and the November quiet of the Harrington house kitchen for a long time. Outside, a wind came through the empty garden at the back and pressed briefly against the window and then moved on. Thomas Reed was sitting in the small staff apartment above the garage of the Harrington property, which Arthur had insisted on making livable as one of the first things he did after buying the place. He was drinking tea and reading, but he was not reading with his full attention. Part of his attention was still on Hartley Street. He had been thinking about the notebook entry since he made it. He had been thinking about the girl, specifically. About the way she had moved on the sidewalk, decisive, no hesitation once she had made the decision. About the way she had sat next to Arthur and talked to him the way you talk to a person, not the way a child talks to an elderly stranger with performed politeness and careful distance, but with genuine curiosity and the willingness to receive genuine answers. He had been thinking about something Arthur had said in the car on the way back, in the tone he used when he was giving Thomas information he was expected to retain. Thomas, he had said, without preface, "Do you know what the visiting hours are at St. Agatha's Hospital?" Thomas had said he did not. He had said he could find out. Arthur had said, "Find out." That was all. But 17 years had given Thomas a fluency in what Arthur's minimal statements contained. And this one contained considerably more than it appeared to. He put down his book and pulled out the notebook and looked at what he had written. He underlined St. Agatha's a third time. Then he made a second note below the first. He wrote, "Watch for the redcoat." He thought this might be the beginning of something. In 17 years, he had developed a reliable sense for when something was beginning. He had felt it the morning Arthur told him about the second ECG, and the morning he came back from the first meeting with the Millfield property agent, and the morning years ago when he had driven Arthur to a small community center on the east side of the city and waited outside while Arthur stayed for 4 hours. He had felt it when the girl took off her coat. He closed the notebook and looked out the small window above the garage at the dark yard below, where the empty garden of the Harrington house was barely visible in the thin moonlight coming through the breaking clouds. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Arthur had a board call at 9. A foundation director meeting at 2. A walk in the afternoon on Hartley Street. Thomas set his alarm for 5:15, which was when he started on the days that required starting early, and turned off the light. In her room on the second floor of the yellow brick building on Crescent and Dunn, Rosie Baxter was asleep. Her red coat hung on the hook by the door. Her backpack sat on the chair. Her homework was done and stacked neatly on the table by the radiator with a pencil laid across it, the way her mother had taught her to leave things so nothing got lost. Her watch was on the dresser. Her mother was still at work, 3 hours yet to go on the second shift, standing at the cafeteria steam table in the particular way of someone who has been standing for most of 14 hours and has made her body's peace with what the next 3 require. Clara Baxter was very good at her job. She was organized and exact and genuinely careful about the food, which mattered in a hospital in ways it did not always matter in other settings. The people who came through the cafeteria line were tired, many of them were frightened or both, and the warmth of a person behind a counter who was paying real attention and had kept the soup at the right temperature was not a small thing. She did not know yet what had happened on Hartley Street that evening. She would find out when she got home at 9, when she sat at the kitchen table and Rosie, who had woken up when the door opened, came out in her pajamas and told her about the old man at the bus shelter and the coat. In the precise and detailed way Rosie told all stories, beginning to middle to end, the relevant information in its correct order. Clara would listen to the whole thing without interrupting. She would look at the red coat on its hook by the door. She would look at her daughter in the kitchen light. She would ask if the man had been all right when he left. Rosie would say he had a driver coming, that he had gotten on the 34 and was fine. Clara would nod and look at the coat again and say, "That was a good thing to do." Rosie would say he was cold. Clara would say, "I know, baby, that's exactly why." She would tuck Rosie in and come back to the kitchen and sit for a while with a cup of tea she didn't finish. She would think about the walk and the bus shelter and a 7-year-old who had not hesitated. She would think about what she had taught her daughter without intending to make a lesson of it, through the simple repetition of her own choices over years. She would think that this was the only way anything important was ever taught. She would not think about Arthur Whitfield, because she did not know his name yet. She would not think about the gray sedan parked 50 yards down Hartley Street. She would not think about a notebook with her workplace written in it and underlined 3 times. She would just sit in the kitchen of the apartment on Crescent and Dunn, in the city of Millfield, in November, and feel the particular weight of a life that was hard in specific and measurable ways, and the particular warmth of a daughter who had not let any of that harden her. Outside, the straightest clouds had finished breaking apart, and the November sky over Millfield was clear and cold and full of stars, the kind of night that follows a gray day and reminds you that the gray is not permanent, that there is always something above it, waiting. Wednesday morning arrived in Millfield with the same flat gray sky that had sat over the city since the beginning of the month. But the wind had dropped overnight, which made the cold more bearable, the kind you could walk through without bracing. Arthur Whitfield was at the kitchen table of the Harrington house by 7, with coffee and a manila folder that Thomas had left on the counter before retiring the night before, a preliminary summary of what he had been able to find out about St. Agatha's Hospital in the 4 hours between dinner and 11 o'clock. Thomas was thorough. This was one of the qualities Arthur had recognized early and had never stopped being grateful for, the particular thoroughness of a person who understood that the difference between useful information and incomplete information was often the one detail you had not thought to look for. The folder contained the hospital's ownership structure, which was a non-profit regional health system called Mercy Ridge Health Partners. It contained the name of the current chief executive officer, a woman named Dr. Renee Holloway, and the names of the board members. It contained a summary of the hospital's public financial disclosures for the past 3 years. At the bottom of the folder was a single handwritten note in Thomas's small, exact script. It said, "Cafeteria operations are contracted through Millfield Food Services. Contract holder, Gerald Prentice. Current contract term ends January 31st. Arthur read the note twice. He set the folder on the table and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the back garden in the morning gray, the dead stalks of last summer's plantings standing at odd angles in the frost. He had his board call at 9. He sat at the desk in the study for an hour and 40 minutes with his phone on speaker, taking the call the way he had always taken calls, with his full attention on the specific matters that required his judgment and a clear delegation of the rest. His son Edward was on the call, and the CFO and 3 division heads. They were capable people. They had always been capable people. Arthur had spent 30 years finding and keeping capable people, and Dr. Nair had been right that the restructuring was achievable because the capacity was already there. He simply had to step back far enough to let it operate without him occupying the center of it. After the call, he sat in the study for a few minutes without picking up his phone. Outside the window of the study, which faced the front of the house, 2 children walked past on the sidewalk with backpacks on, heading in the direction of the elementary school. He watched them until they were out of sight. He told Thomas at noon that he intended to walk Hartley Street again that afternoon. Thomas said, "The wind is down today, sir. Should be manageable." "Good," Arthur said. "I would like to walk further than last time." He paused. "East toward Crescent Avenue." Thomas looked at him with the neutral attention he maintained in moments when he was receiving information he intended to think carefully about later. He said, "I'll follow at a distance." Arthur put on his coat, his actual coat, the heavy charcoal overcoat he had worn the day before and left in the car. He also put on a scarf, which he had not done in some years, and which he had found that morning in the top shelf of the coat closet in the entryway. A gray wool scarf Jean had given him sometime in the mid-90s, still folded the way it had been folded when she put it there. He walked Hartley Street at 2:30 in the afternoon, when it was quiet in the way of streets that are busy at certain hours and empty in the intervals. The coin laundry was running. The pharmacy was open. The bus shelter stood empty, the metal bench visible through the smudged glass. He looked at it as he passed, at the exact position on the bench where he had been sitting the day before, and at the position a few feet to the left where she had sat. He turned onto Crescent Avenue. He had not been on this street in approximately 40 years. The last time had been a summer evening in his late 20s when he had driven through this part of the city on the way to somewhere he could not now remember, and the street had been full of people in the way of summer evenings in neighborhoods where the apartments don't have air conditioning and everyone sits outside. He had not stopped. He had driven through. It looked smaller now than it had in his memory, or perhaps not smaller but more particular, the individuality of each building clearer when you were on foot than when you were moving past in a car. Yellow brick on the left side, mid-block. A building with a covered entrance and window boxes that were empty now, the soil dark from the last of autumn's rain, the kind of window boxes that would have flowers in them in May. He stood on the sidewalk in front of it and looked at the second floor. He was not certain which window was hers. He had no way to know. He was simply standing on the street where she walked home 3 days a week with a key on a yellow lanyard, doing the math of her own safety with the quiet practicality that she had been taught. He stood there for a while. Then he turned and walked back. That evening, He had Thomas drive him to St. Agatha's Hospital. He did not go as himself. That was not entirely accurate. He went as Arthur Whitfield, he had no other way of going. But he did not announce himself. He walked into the hospital through the main entrance, collected a visitor's badge from the desk by citing a routine follow-up to his cardiac work, and found the cafeteria on the ground floor map posted near the elevators. The cafeteria at St. Agatha's served patients, visitors, and staff. At 6 in the evening it was moderately full, the particular population of a hospital cafeteria in the dinner hour. Nurses on short breaks eating quickly, family members of patients who needed somewhere to sit, a few orderlies, a resident in scrubs with the expression of someone who had not slept properly in 2 days. The food was served from a long steam table along the back wall, and behind it 3 workers moved in the steady, practiced rhythm of people who do the same physical tasks many times a day and have learned to find their efficiency within the routine. The woman at the center station was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, wearing the gray uniform shirt of Millfield Food Services with her name on a badge above the pocket. Arthur could not read the badge from where he stood at the beginning of the line, but he watched her work while the line moved forward. She was efficient and exact, the movements of someone who understood that her function was to be accurate and fast without cutting corners on either. She portioned correctly. She maintained the temperature of the food. When an elderly man in a visitor badge told her the soup was for his wife who was on the 3rd floor and could he have extra crackers, she said of course and reached below the counter and added a handful to the tray without making anything of it. When an orderly 2 people ahead of Arthur said he was in a hurry and could she move faster, she moved faster without comment. When the line slowed because the tray rack at the far end had jammed, she called to one of her co-workers, a younger woman on the salad side, and the rack was cleared in 90 seconds and the line moved again. Arthur took a tray and sat at a table near the windows. He ate the soup, which was better than he expected, and watched the service line. The supervisor came out from the back at 6:20. A broad woman in her late 40s with a clipboard and the compressed expression of someone carrying more administrative weight than she had room for. She walked the line checking temperatures and quantities and spoke briefly with the woman in the center station in a tone too low for Arthur to catch. Whatever she said, the center worker's face shifted slightly. Not distress exactly, but the adjustment you make when you receive information you were half expecting and have already begun calculating the consequences of. She nodded. The supervisor went back through the swinging door to the kitchen area. Arthur stayed at the table for another 20 minutes, eating without hurry. At 6:45, when the dinner rush thinned, he returned his tray to the rack and looked at the name badge on the center station worker as he passed. Clara Baxter. He walked back to the elevator without changing his pace. In the gray sedan, Thomas said nothing when Arthur got in. He pulled away from the hospital entrance and drove back toward Maple Drive. At the first stoplight, he said, without turning around, "Were you able to see what you needed to see?" Arthur looked out the window at the Millfield evening, the storefronts lit against the dark. "Yes," he said. He paused. "She's good at her job." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She appears to be." The board call had been at 9. The walk had been in the afternoon. The hospital visit had been in the evening. Arthur was not a man who did things without reason, and Thomas had spent 17 years calibrating his understanding of the difference between what Arthur said and what Arthur was doing. What Thomas understood, from the folder on the kitchen counter and the visit to St. Agatha's and the walk down Crescent Avenue, was that Arthur Whitfield was in the middle of something he had not fully named yet, even to himself, and that Thomas's job at this point was to make sure the information was ready when it was needed. He underlined St. Agatha's a 4th time when he got back to the garage apartment that night and added 3 lines of notes below it. Then he called a contact at the county business registry and asked about Millfield Food Services and Gerald Prentice. Thursday was Rosie's day. She knew it was Thursday because Thursday was the day they had spelling tests at school, and because Thursday was the day Mrs. Finch brought the tin of butterscotch candies instead of the peppermints, a rotation Rosie had observed over 2 months and found reliable. She finished her spelling test in 11 minutes out of the 15 allotted, checked it twice, and turned it in. Mrs. Hammond put a small star in the corner when she took it, which meant she had seen something worth noting before she had finished reading it. After school, Rosie went to the gymnasium and did her homework while the other children played. This was not because she was required to do her homework at the program, but because she had found that doing it there, with the noise of other children in the background, was easier than doing it alone at the table by the radiator, where the silence of the apartment was sometimes large in a way she did not have words for. She completed her math worksheets and the reading response paragraph and was starting on the extra credit weather journal entry when Mrs. Finch called 5:30. She put on her coat, zipped to the top, backpack on both shoulders, and went out the side door. The cold on Thursday was less severe than Tuesday had been. The straightest layer had thinned overnight, and there were breaks in it that let through a low, pale afternoon light that did not warm anything but made the street look different, the brick buildings catching it and throwing it back with a faint amber quality. Rosie noted the light as she walked, filing it in the section of her thinking reserved for weather observations, which had grown considerably since the classroom project. She turned onto Hartley Street. He was sitting in the bus shelter. This time he was dressed correctly. The heavy overcoat, a gray scarf. He was sitting on the bench with a paper cup in each hand, and he looked up when she stopped on the sidewalk, and something in his expression was different from Tuesday, more settled, the expression of a person who had been expecting something and had arrived at the moment of it. "You came back," Rosie said. He held out one of the paper cups. "Hot chocolate. I asked them to put extra." She looked at the cup. Then she walked into the shelter and took it and sat down, leaving the appropriate space between them, and wrapped her hands around it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. His own cup was coffee, black, she could smell it. "Are you walking again today?" she asked. "I walked earlier." He paused. "I thought I would sit here for a while." She understood without asking that he had been waiting for her, though she did not say so because it seemed like the kind of thing that was obvious to both of them and did not need to be pointed out. They drank in quiet for a moment. "Did you find the things you forgot?" she asked. He looked at her. "What things?" "The things you said you walked to remember." She tilted her head slightly. "About what to pay attention to." He looked at the street. "Some of them." He was quiet for a beat. "I walked down Crescent Avenue yesterday." "We live on Crescent," she said. "I know." She looked at him. He looked at the street. There was a moment between them that was not uncomfortable but that had a quality of weight to it. The weight of two people who know more about each other's circumstances than they have explicitly been told. She drank her hot chocolate. He drank his coffee. "How is school?" he asked. "Good. We had spelling today. I got all of them right." "What word gave you the most trouble?" She considered this seriously. "Continuous," she said. "I kept wanting to put two N's in it." He looked at her with his gray eyes. "But you didn't." "I checked twice," she said. "That's what Mrs. Hammond says to do." "What does Mrs. Hammond say about the checking?" "She says the first time you write it down is your instinct and the second time you look at it is your judgment, and judgment is what you trust." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "That is excellent advice for almost everything," he said. "That's what she says. She says it's just about spelling on the surface." He almost smiled in the way she had seen on Tuesday. She had decided she liked that expression. It had the quality of something that was carefully kept but that you could see was there, the way her grandmother kept a bottle of good wine on the top shelf that was only for when something had been particularly worth celebrating. She told him about the straightest clouds breaking up. She told him about the amber light and how she had been trying to figure out if it was the same light that happened in late October or a different kind, and that she thought it was different but wasn't sure exactly why. He said he thought she was right that it was different, that the angle of the sun in November versus October produced a qualitatively different quality of light even when the cloud cover was similar, and she filed this information with the seriousness she gave all new and accurate facts. He asked about her mother. "Clara," she said. "She works the double on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Wednesdays." She told him this the way she had told him on Tuesday, plainly, as relevant information rather than complaint. "Does she like her work?" Rosie thought about this carefully. "I think she likes the people," she said. "She talks about some of them at dinner. There's a man named Mr. Patterson who comes every Tuesday and always orders the same thing, and she saves it for him because by the time he comes through the line they sometimes run out." She thought a little more. "I don't think she likes some of the other parts." "What other parts?" She didn't have a precise answer. She had overheard things she had not fully understood. Her mother on the phone Wednesday evening in the kitchen, speaking in the tone she used when she was working very hard to stay calm. Something about hours. Something about December. The specific content had been unclear, but the quality of the conversation had not been. "I think her schedule is changing," Rosie said. "She heard Mom on the phone last night and she sounded like she does when she's figuring things out." Arthur looked at his coffee cup. "When you say figuring things out," he said, "does she do that often?" Rosie was honest. "Sometimes," she said. "Things are harder since Dad left." She said this without self-pity, as a simple fact in the sequence of facts that made up her understanding of how her life worked. "My mom says you just figure it out and then it gets figured out, but it takes time." "When did your father leave?" 3 years ago." Rosie was quiet for a second. "He took the car." "We don't have a car anymore." He received this with the same stillness he brought to everything she said. "What is your mother's last name?" he asked after a pause that felt like it had something behind it. "Baxter," she said. "Clara Baxter. Her badge at work says it." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the street with an expression she could not entirely read, the reading expression she had noticed on Tuesday, but with something added to it now that she might have described, if she had the vocabulary for it, as the expression of a person who has just had two things connect inside them that had been separate until this moment. He said nothing about what he was thinking. He simply drank his coffee and asked her what she was making for the Weather Journal, and she told him about the amber light and the straightest breaks and the theory she was developing about November light, and he listened with the full quality of attention that she had come to expect from him in 2 encounters and that she did not take for granted because she understood, in the way that children who have been paying attention to the adults around them understand, that this kind of attention was not as common as it should be. When the 34 came, she gave him the paper cup to throw away. He said, "Same time Tuesday." It was not a question. She considered it for a moment with the head tilt that meant she was thinking through the plan. "Okay," she said. "I'll bring something." He looked at her. "What will you bring?" She thought about this. "The pierogi recipe is in Cleveland," she said. "But my mom makes good soup. I can put some in a thermos." He looked at her for a long moment with the controlled expression that she had learned held more than it showed. "I would like that," he said. "Thank you, Rosie." She walked home in the amber light with the taste of hot chocolate and the particular feeling she sometimes had after talking with someone who had listened to her properly. A warmth that was separate from the hot chocolate and from the coat, the warmth that came from being inside a conversation where both people were actually present. In the gray sedan at the corner of Hartley and Bay, Thomas Reed watched her walk away with her backpack on both shoulders and her pace quick and purposeful until she turned onto Crescent Avenue. He looked at his notebook. Clara Baxter, Crescent and Dunn, St. Agatha's Cafeteria. He put the sedan in drive. That evening, Arthur sat at the kitchen table of the Harrington house with the research folder Thomas had updated and expanded during the day. It was a substantial folder now. Thomas had a gift for finding the specific piece of information that turned general knowledge into actionable understanding, and what he had assembled in the past 48 hours about Millfield Food Services and Gerald Prentice was thorough in precisely that way. Gerald Prentice was 61 years old and had operated Millfield Food Services for 23 years. He had built the company on the model of competitive bidding, undercutting larger institutional food service providers on contract price and making up the margin through labor cost management, which in practice meant a workforce that turned over frequently, benefited minimally, and whose hours were adjusted in response to contract pressures rather than the needs of the workers themselves. The company held cafeteria contracts at 3 hospitals in the greater Millfield area, a school district contract that ran 18 facilities, and 2 corporate campus accounts. The St. Agatha's contract had been in place for 9 years and had been renegotiated twice, each renewal at a lower service rate than the last. The current contract expired January 31st. The renegotiation was already in progress. Prentice had submitted a bid that reduced the per meal service cost by 6% from the current rate, which required, in his cost model, a reduction in full-time labor hours of approximately 20%. The method he had chosen was reclassification, moving full-time workers to what his contracts called the flexible availability pool, which meant no guaranteed hours, no benefits continuation, and no obligation on the company's part to provide consistent scheduling. The reclassification list contained 15 names. Clara Baxter was on it, listed as a senior line worker with 4 years of continuous service, which was an error. Thomas had found her original hire date through a contact at the State Labor Board. She had been at St. Agatha's for 2.5 years. Not 4, but her classification was listed as senior because she had been doing the work of 2 positions since a coworker had left 6 months ago and had not been replaced. Arthur read through the reclassification list slowly. 15 workers, most with between 2 and 5 years of service. Several with children listed in their benefit enrollment forms, which Thomas had accessed through a contact at the Benefits Administration office. He closed the folder. He thought about Gerald Prentice for a few minutes. Not with heat, not with the moral simplification of a man who needed a villain to justify an action. He thought about Prentice with the clear assessment of someone who had spent 40 years looking at how businesses operated and understanding the specific logic of the decisions made inside them. Prentice was doing what his business model required him to do. He was cutting where it was legal to cut. The hospital administration was not looking closely because the contract renewal went through a procurement office that evaluated bids on cost rather than on labor standards, and no one in the structure had been assigned to ask the question that would have changed the outcome. This was how it worked. Arthur knew exactly how it worked. He had seen it work from the inside of structures that operated similarly, structures he had built, structures his father had built, structures that had for decades treated labor as a variable to be managed rather than a commitment to be honored. He had not thought about it consistently enough, and Dr. Nair's ECG had not changed that, but walking down Crescent Avenue on a Wednesday afternoon and reading a list of 15 names on a Thursday evening was changing something. He thought about his grandfather, Edward, who had started the manufacturing plant in 1938 because he knew the people who would work in it, who had known that what he was building was not separate from the city he lived in but was a part of it, made from the same material, responsible to the same community. Arthur had taken that plant's legacy 4 billion miles away from that specific knowledge, and he had done it with the quiet, incremental logic of business decisions that each made sense individually and that together had produced a distance he had not, until 3 months ago, fully understood. He was 69 years old. He had time, Dr. Nair said, if he was careful with it. He did not have unlimited time. He had the specific amount of time that remained, which was an unknown quantity and therefore needed to be used as though it might be less than expected. He picked up his phone and called Caroline. She answered on the 3rd ring, the particular tone of a person who has picked up quickly but is managing several things at once. "Dad, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," he said. "I wanted to call." A brief pause on her end. He could hear what was happening on the Seattle side. The muffled noise of children somewhere in the house, James and Nora, a television in another room. "I've been walking," he said. Another pause. "Walking? Dr. Nair's prescription. Tuesday afternoons." He paused. "I've been going further than prescribed." A longer silence. "How far?" He looked out the kitchen window at the dark garden. "I walked down Crescent Avenue yesterday. It's near where I grew up." He paused. "I hadn't been there in 40 years. He heard Caroline move. He heard the sound of a door, slightly muffled, the way sound changes when a person has stepped into a quieter room because the conversation has become one that requires it. "What were you looking for?" she said. He thought about this. "Some things I stopped noticing," he said. "Your mother used to say I worked too hard and missed too much of what was real. I thought she meant something about her and me, which she did. But I think she meant other things too." Caroline was quiet for a moment. He told her about the legal pad, about the 2 questions he had written, about Hartley Street and the coin laundry and the bus shelter. He did not tell her yet about the girl in the red coat, because that story needed to be told in full and this call was only the beginning of it. She said, "Are you actually thinking about being less involved in the company?" "I'm thinking about what involved means," he said, "and whether what I've been involved in is everything it should have been." "That." Her voice was careful in the way of a person who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a long time and is not certain she trusts that it is actually happening. "I know," he said. "I know it's late to be saying this. It's not too late. I would like to come for Christmas." The silence this time was different from the others. It was full rather than empty. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality of a person controlling something. "Okay," she said. "Yes. Come for Christmas." He said, "I want to see the kids. James and Nora. They want to see you too." She paused. "Nora still talks about the last time. She says she told you about Orion." "She was 4, he said. "She told me a lot of things." "She remembers it," Caroline said. "Every detail." He sat with that for a long moment. "I'll have Thomas book the flights," he said. "After Christmas. The week after." "Good." Her voice had settled into something warm. "Good, Dad." When he put the phone down, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, through the window, the back garden was a series of dark shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the open sky. He had looked at a nursery catalog in the study that week, a catalog Thomas had ordered for him from a company in Columbus that specialized in cold-weather perennials. He had not made any decisions yet. He had simply looked. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. On Friday afternoon, Millfield Food Services sent formal letters. Clara Baxter received hers on Friday evening. She found it under the door of the apartment on Crescent and Dunn when she came home from the day shift, the single shift Friday that she had always thought of as the rest day of the week, the day when she got home before 4 and had an evening with Rosie that felt, however briefly, like the evenings should feel. She picked the envelope up from the floor inside the door and looked at the return address on it, and the particular feeling that moved through her in that moment was not panic but its quieter precursor, the feeling of a person who has been calculating the margins of their own situation carefully enough to know when a new number is going to change everything. She put the envelope on the kitchen table without opening it. She went to hang up her coat. She asked Rosie how the spelling test had gone, and Rosie said she had gotten all of them right, and Clara said that was wonderful, and she meant it completely, and the warmth of it and the cold of the envelope sat side by side in her chest as she filled the kettle and put it on. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It was written in the specific language of formal business notices, which is a language designed to convey information clearly while remaining emotionally inert. The information was, effective December 1st, her employment classification was being changed from full-time senior line worker to flexible availability pool. Her scheduled hours for December were being confirmed on a week-by-week basis. Her benefits enrollment would be reviewed at the end of the current quarter. Benefits enrollment. That was the sentence she read 3 times. Her health coverage for herself and Rosie came through the Millfield Food Services group plan. The December 30th renewal date had been in her calendar since September, marked in red, a date she had felt securely anchored to because her employment status was stable. The phrase would be reviewed did not mean the same thing as is secure. She put the letter on the table and looked at the wall above the refrigerator where Rosie had taped 3 drawings from school, a weather diagram, a map of Lake Erie with the currents labeled, and a drawing of 2 people in a kitchen that was clearly the 2 of them, Clara and Rosie, the taller figure and the smaller one, both with braids. She did the numbers. Not for the first time. She had been doing a version of these numbers for 3 years, but the specific combination had changed. $850 in rent. The payment arrangement from the credit card debt Marcus had left, $94 a month through March. The health insurance copay that came out of her check, $63 a month. Utilities averaging $140 in winter. Rosie's school lunch account, which had a balance of $11 currently. Groceries, phone, winter shoes that Rosie needed by January. She had been managing all of this on the full-time wage. The flexible pool meant no guaranteed hours, which meant no guaranteed income, which meant the numbers did not work anymore in the same configuration. She was good at figuring things out. She had always been good at it. But figuring things out required having pieces to work with, and this letter had removed several of the pieces she had counted on. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was still in her school clothes, her backpack beside the table where she had left it when she came home. She looked at the letter on the table and then at Clara, with the careful attention she had been applying to her mother's face for 3 years, learning to read the moods the way she read the weather. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Clara looked at her daughter. There was a sentence she had said many times in various forms that meant, "I am handling it, you do not need to worry, I will figure it out." She had said it about Marcus leaving and the car being gone and the credit card letters and the pension shortfall at the dental office, and a dozen other specific challenges that had arrived without invitation and been dealt with by increments. She said it now. "Just something at work I need to sort out," she said. "Come sit with me." Rosie came and sat across the table. She put her hands in her lap and looked at her mother with the head tilt. "What kind of something?" "Work is changing my schedule," Clara said. It means I need to find some new arrangements. Arrangements like what? Clara chose the version that was honest without being larger than a 7-year-old needed to hold. It means I have to be flexible about when I work for a while, she said. I might work different hours. It's a change. Rosie looked at the letter, which was still on the table between them, and then looked at her mother. She did not ask to read it. She did not need to. She had heard the phone call Wednesday night, and she had watched her mother's face when she came in and found the envelope, and she had the particular intelligence of a child who has paid close attention to the adults around her for long enough to understand what various qualities of silence mean. I could take better care of the apartment, she said. When you're at work. Like more things. You already take good care of the apartment, Clara said. You don't need to do more. I could walk home 4 days instead of 3 and not go to Mrs. Finch's program as much. You go to Mrs. Finch's program because I want you to, not just because I have to work. But it costs, Rosie, Clara said gently. I'll handle it. Rosie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded with the particular quality of a child who has decided to trust the adult in front of them not because the evidence is fully reassuring but because trusting them is how you show that you understand they are trying. She went back to her homework. Clara made soup, the specific soup she made on the days when the act of making something warm was itself a useful thing. A chicken soup that required attention and produced a smell that had always made the apartment feel more like the apartment was supposed to feel. While she cooked, she thought about who to call. There was a woman at the hospital, a registered nurse named Janet Polk, who had told Clara last spring that if anything ever changed with her work situation she should call, that there was a patient care aid program that was always looking for people with the right instincts and the right disposition and that Clara had both. Clara had filed the information away and had not needed it. She was thinking about it now. She was also thinking about the insurance. The specific and urgent weight of the insurance. In the Harrington House kitchen on Maple Drive, Arthur Whitfield was looking at his legal pad. He had written 2 questions on it 2 nights ago. Below those 2 questions he had been writing and crossing out and writing again, the process of a person working toward something they were not yet ready to name formally but whose shape was becoming clear. Thomas came to the door of the kitchen at 8:15. Arthur looked up. I have the information you asked for this morning, Thomas said. He set a second folder on the table beside the first one. This one was thinner, for pages. Arthur opened it. The Whitfield Capital Holdings portfolio included, among its commercial property holdings, the building at 1140 Commerce Boulevard that currently housed Millfield Food Services administrative offices. This was not a thing Arthur had known this morning. It was a thing Thomas had found in the afternoon by cross-referencing the property records against the portfolio inventory, the kind of cross-reference that required knowing both sides of the equation. The lease on 1140 Commerce Boulevard ran to the end of the following year. Arthur read the page twice. He set it down. There was a second page with the name of the Mercy Ridge Health Partners procurement director, a man named Dennis Carver, who handled vendor contract renewals for all 3 Mercy Ridge facilities including St. Agatha's. There was a third page with a summary of the State Labor Board's guidelines on worker reclassification, specifically the provisions related to the conversion of full-time positions to on-call status and the notice requirements that applied. There was a fourth page. It was handwritten in Thomas's small exact script. It said, Clara Baxter, 4 years cafeteria service listed on company records. Actual hire date, 2 years 7 months per State Labor Board. Discrepancy may affect severance calculation if reclassification triggers constructive dismissal standard. Senior classification assigned due to dual role coverage following non-replacement of departed coworker. No documented pay adjustment for expanded duties. Current hourly, $14.10. $14.10 per hour. Arthur looked at the number for a long time. He knew what numbers meant. He had spent 40 years working with numbers that were very large, and the particular skill of managing large numbers was that you learned to hold them in abstract rather than specific terms, because the specific terms of very large numbers were difficult to maintain without losing the ability to make clear decisions about them. $4 billion was a concept. $14.10 per hour was a person. He thought about the woman he had watched at the steam table on Wednesday evening, portioning accurately, keeping the temperature right, saving extra crackers for the man whose wife was on the 3rd floor. He thought about the phone call that Rosie had described, her mother's voice on Wednesday night, working hard to stay calm. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who said that when her mother used the phrase figuring things out, it meant things were not okay. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory, the number of a man named Robert Alcott who ran the legal division of Whitfield Capital Holdings and who had been with the company for 14 years and who had never once, in Arthur's experience, asked an unnecessary question. When Robert answered, Arthur said, "I need your office to pull the lease file on 1140 Commerce Boulevard. Tonight, if possible." Robert did not ask why. He said he would have it within the hour. Arthur set the phone on the table and looked at the legal pad. Below the 2 questions he had written 2 nights ago, he wrote a third. It was not strategic, not in the way his business writing was strategic. It was the question that had been present since Tuesday evening on a cold bus seat, holding a child's red coat folded in his lap. He wrote, "What is the point of all of it if not this?" He did not answer the question. He did not need to. The answer was in the action he was already beginning, in the lease file being pulled, in Robert Alcott's office moving on a Friday night, in Thomas's notebook with St. Agatha's underlined 4 times. He closed the legal pad and put on the kettle and stood at the window above the kitchen sink and looked at the back garden in the dark. The frost on the dead stalks caught the faint light from the window and held it briefly, a row of small specific lights in the dark of the garden. He was 69 years old, and he had come back to the city where his grandfather had started something by knowing the people who lived in it. He had a legal pad with 3 questions on it, and a portfolio with $4 billion in it, and a phone call to Seattle booked for the week after Christmas, and a 7-year-old girl who had offered him her coat in a bus shelter without hesitation and then walked home in a sweater in the cold. He thought that this was, in its specific and particular way, exactly the moment his life had been building toward. Not in the providential sense, not in the sense of destiny, which was a word Arthur had no use for. In the sense that every decision he had ever made, every avenue he had taken and everyone he had avoided, had accumulated into this specific evening, this kitchen, this window, this garden, this city, this question on a legal pad. He thought about what it would mean to answer it. Outside, Millfield was cold in November and going about its Friday evening. The people on the streets moving quickly with their collars up. The windows of the buildings on every block lit from inside with the ordinary warmth of other people's lives. On Crescent Avenue, on the 2nd floor of a yellow brick building, Clara Baxter was in the kitchen listening to her daughter's breathing from across the hall and doing the numbers again in her head in the dark, the way you do the numbers when you are a person who has learned that the numbers are always there, waiting, and the only useful response to them is to stay awake enough to see them clearly. She did not know yet that on Maple Drive, 11 blocks away, a man was standing at a kitchen window asking a question about the point of everything he had built. She did not know his name. She did not know about the legal pad, or the lease file being pulled on a Friday night, or the notebook with her workplace underlined 4 times. She knew only what her daughter had told her over dinner. That on Tuesday, when Rosie had given her coat to an old man in the bus shelter, he had used the word important about the cafeteria work. That he had said it plainly, the way you say things you actually believe. She had sat with that for a moment at dinner, receiving it. Then she had said, "Some people mean it when they say things like that. You can usually tell which ones." Rosie had nodded. "Out of town?" she had asked. "No," Rosie said. "He grew up here. His name is Arthur." Clara had nodded and thought nothing of it. She had thought of the letter instead, and the numbers and the insurance renewal in December. She went to sleep with the numbers and the letter and the practical stubborn certainty that there was a way through this, that there was always a way through, that she had proven that 3 years running and would prove it again. She did not know that the way through was already in motion. She did not know that it had been in motion since Tuesday evening, when her daughter stopped on a sidewalk and looked at a stranger who was cold and made the particular, unconditional, unremarkable decision that changed everything. Robert Alcott called at 7:45 Monday morning, before Arthur had finished his first cup of coffee. He apologized for the hour and said he would not have called early if it were not worth calling early for. "It is," he said, "an interesting situation." Arthur told him to come to the house. Robert arrived at 9 with 2 associates and a leather case that contained the lease file on 1140 Commerce Boulevard and a summary his team had prepared over the weekend. He was 51 years old, a compact, precise man who wore the same quality of suit every day, and who had been with Whitfield Capital for 14 years because Arthur had hired him away from a firm that did not deserve him and had never once regretted it. He laid the documents on the kitchen table with the economy of a person who understood that clarity was more useful than presentation. The building at 1140 Commerce Boulevard had been in the Whitfield portfolio for 9 years, acquired as part of a commercial property package from a developer who was liquidating. The lease with Millfield Food Services had been in place for 7 of those 9 years, at a rate that had been fixed at signing and adjusted only once, a 3% increase in year 4. The current rate was below the prevailing market rate for comparable commercial space in the same district by approximately 22%. Below market, Arthur said. Significantly, Robert said. The original lease was structured by the commercial division under the volume acquisition terms. No one flagged it for individual review. Arthur looked at the number on the page. Then he looked at the second document Robert had placed beside it, the Millfield Food Services operating summary Thomas had compiled, and at the third, which was the reclassification list with 15 names. He looked at the number beside Clara Baxter's name. $14.10. He said, I want to know what a renegotiated lease at fair market rate looks like for Prentice's operating margins. Robert said he had run that calculation. He turned to the third page of his summary and placed his finger at the relevant line. At current market rate, the lease increase would eliminate approximately 38% of Millfield Food Services' annual net margin. It would not close the company, but it would make the aggressive underbidding on hospital contracts unworkable as a business model. The math would no longer hold. Arthur nodded. Robert looked at him with the careful attention he always brought to moments when Arthur was deciding something. He said, I want to make sure I understand the objective correctly. Arthur said, the objective is that 15 people keep their jobs, their hours, and their benefits, and that the next set of 15 people after them keeps theirs. He paused. I want a structure that makes the underbidding model unsustainable without us having to intervene every time. The lease renegotiation is part of that. The other part is the contract. Robert nodded slowly. You want to go to the hospital. I want to go to the procurement director at Mercy Ridge, Arthur said. Dennis Carver. I want to propose that the new contract terms include a labor standards floor. Minimum hours, benefits continuity, documented pay grades. He looked at the table. I want Carver to understand that Whitfield Capital has a significant real estate relationship with the Mercy Ridge system and that we are willing to invest further in that relationship if the system moves in this direction on labor standards. Robert was quiet for a moment. He said, that is not a threat. It is not, Arthur agreed. It's leverage applied toward a specific outcome that benefits the workers. Yes. Robert wrote something in his notebook. Is Prentice the target here, or is the system the target? Arthur said, Prentice will survive or not survive based on whether his model can adapt. That is his business problem. The system is where I can do something permanent. Robert closed the notebook and looked at Arthur directly, the look of a man who had worked for the same hall and doing the numbers again in her head in the dark, the way you do the numbers when you are a person who has learned that the numbers are always there, waiting, and the only useful response to them is to stay awake enough to see them clearly. She did not know yet that on Maple Drive, 11 blocks away, a man was standing at a kitchen window asking a question about the point of everything he had built. She did not know his name. She did not know about the legal pad, or the lease file being pulled on a Friday night, or the notebook with her workplace underlined 4 times. She knew only what her daughter had told her over dinner. That on Tuesday, when Rosie had given her coat to an old man in the bus shelter, he had used the word important about the cafeteria work, that he had said it plainly, the way you say things you actually believe. She had sat with that for a moment at dinner, receiving it. Then she had said, some people mean it when they say things like that. You can usually tell which ones. Rosie had nodded. Out of town? She had asked. No, Rosie said. He grew up here. His name is Arthur. Clara had nodded and thought nothing of it. She had thought of the letter instead, and the numbers and the insurance renewal in December. She went to sleep with the numbers and the letter and the practical stubborn certainty that there was a way through this, that there was always a way through, that she had proven that 3 years running and would prove it again. She did not know that the way through was already in motion. She did not know that it had been in motion since Tuesday evening, when her daughter stopped on a sidewalk and looked at a stranger who was cold and made the particular, unconditional, unremarkable decision that changed everything. Robert Alcott called at 7:45 Monday morning, before Arthur had finished his first cup of coffee. He apologized for the hour and said he would not have called early if it were not worth calling early for. "It is," he said, "an interesting situation." Arthur told him to come to the house. Robert arrived at 9 with 2 associates and a leather case that contained the lease file on 1140 Commerce Boulevard and a summary his team had prepared over the weekend. He was 51 years old, a compact, precise man who wore the same quality of suit every day, and who had been with Whitfield Capital for 14 years because Arthur had hired him away from a firm that did not deserve him and had never once regretted it. He laid the documents on the kitchen table with the economy of a person who understood that clarity was more useful than presentation. The building at 1140 Commerce Boulevard had been in the Whitfield portfolio for 9 years, acquired as part of a commercial property package from a developer who was liquidating. The lease with Millfield Food Services had been in place for 7 of those 9 years, at a rate that had been fixed at signing and adjusted only once, a 3% increase in year 4. The current rate was below the prevailing market rate for comparable commercial space in the same district by approximately 22%. Below market, Arthur said. Significantly, Robert said. The original lease was structured by the commercial division under the volume acquisition terms. No one flagged it for individual review. Arthur looked at the number on the page. Then he looked at the second document Robert had placed beside it, the Millfield Food Services operating summary Thomas had compiled, and at the third, which was the reclassification list with 15 names. He looked at the number beside Clara Baxter's name. $14.10. He said, "I want to know what a renegotiated lease at fair market rate looks like for Prentice's operating margins." Robert said he had run that calculation. He turned to the third page of his summary and placed his finger at the relevant line. At current market rate, the lease increase would eliminate approximately 38% of Millfield Food Services' annual net margin. It would not close the company, but it would make the aggressive underbidding on hospital contracts unworkable as a business model. The math would no longer hold. Arthur nodded. Robert looked at him with the careful attention he always brought to moments when Arthur was deciding something. He said, "I want to make sure I understand the objective correctly." Arthur said, "The objective is that 15 people keep their jobs, their hours, and their benefits, and that the next set of 15 people after them keeps theirs." He paused. "I want a structure that makes the underbidding model unsustainable without us having to intervene every time. The lease renegotiation is part of that. The other part is the contract." Robert nodded slowly. "You want to go to the hospital?" "I want to go to the procurement director at Mercy Ridge," Arthur said. "Dennis Carver. I want to propose that the new contract terms include a labor standards floor. Minimum hours, benefits continuity, documented pay grades." He looked at the table. "I want Carver to understand that Whitfield Capital has a significant real estate relationship with the Mercy Ridge system and that we are willing to invest further in that relationship if the system moves in this direction on labor standards." Robert was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is not a threat." "It is not," Arthur agreed. "It's leverage applied toward a specific outcome that benefits the workers." "Yes." Robert wrote something in his notebook. "Is Prentice the target here, or is the system the target?" Arthur said, "Prentice will survive or not survive based on whether his model can adapt. That is his business problem. The system is where I can do something permanent." Robert closed the notebook and looked at Arthur directly, the look of a man who had worked for the same. Friday morning, before the first shift, standing in the kitchen while Rosie was in the bathroom brushing her teeth and the kettle was heating on the stove. She had rehearsed nothing. She had decided that rehearsing what to say to a person you have never met about a thing they did for you without being asked was a way of making the conversation smaller than it was, and the conversation deserved to be its full size. He answered on the second ring. She said, "My name is Clara Baxter. I think you know who I am." He said, "I do. Thank you for calling." She said, "I know what you did. I don't know all the details and I don't need to, but I know enough to know that I want to say thank you properly." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your daughter gave me her coat." She said, "That's not the same thing." He said, "No, it isn't. But it started something." He paused. "She gave me her coat and she sat with me in the cold and she talked to me the way she would talk to anyone, without performing anything and without wanting anything back." He paused again. I had not had a conversation like that in longer than I want to say out loud. Clara was quiet. He said, I made some calls. I used some leverage I had. The leverage was mine to use. The workers on that list deserved what they had been told they were losing, and Prentice's model of taking it from them was something that was in my power to interrupt. That is all it was. That's not all it was, Clara said. She let that sit for a moment. But I hear what you're saying. He said, how are you? She thought about the honest answer. Better than I was last Friday, she said. He said, good. I hope it continues in that direction. She said, my daughter thinks very highly of you. He was quiet again, the quality of quiet she would come to understand as the one he used when something had reached him. He said, I think very highly of her. A pause. She said, she told me you're coming back on Tuesdays. He said, she's bringing soup. Clara looked at the kettle. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and not quite the kind of sound that sits at the border of the two things. She said, it's good soup. He said, she described it. I believe you. Millfield Food Services lost the Mercy Ridge contract renewal 4 weeks later. The new terms that Carver and his team drew up, with input from Robert Alcott's labor standards framework, required minimum guaranteed hours for all contracted workers, benefits continuity for those who had held positions for more than 12 months, and documented pay grades with defined criteria for advancement. The terms also required a living wage floor that sat above Prentice's current maximum rate for senior positions. Prentice submitted a revised bid that tried to meet the new terms. The numbers didn't work. His margins had been built on the old model, and the old model was no longer the model on offer. His revised bid came in above the next competitors by 9%, which in institutional procurement meant he was not in the conversation anymore. He lost St. Agatha's first. Then the other 2 Mercy Ridge facilities followed in the same contracting cycle. He did not lose them because anyone punished him. He lost them because the terms changed, and his business model could not follow the terms. That was the quiet and specific way that the things people build on other people's difficulty tend to collapse. Not all at once, but when the conditions that made the exploitation workable are removed, what remains cannot support its own weight. The lease at 1140 Commerce Boulevard was renegotiated at market rate when it came up for renewal review. Prentice requested a meeting with the Whitfield Capital commercial team and was told that the new rate was the rate and that the team was happy to discuss it. He did not contest it. The increased overhead, combined with the contract losses, required him to close 2 of his 3 regional offices and reduce his operations to the school district contracts, which ran under different standards provisions and which he would eventually lose as well, though that took another 2 years. Robert Alcott, when he reported the outcome to Arthur, said simply, the structure held. Arthur said, good. The new cafeteria contractor at St. Agatha's was a regional food service company based in Columbus that had built its operating model around stable employment, which meant lower turnover, which meant better food and better service, which the nursing staff noticed within the first month and mentioned repeatedly in the patient satisfaction surveys that winter. Clara Baxter's position was reclassified as part of the transition to the new contractor. Her dual-role work was formally documented and compensated. Her new hourly rate was $18.50. Her benefits were continuous. Her Thursday double shift remained a Thursday double shift, because she had built her life around its schedule and the schedule was hers to keep. She stood at the steam table on the first morning of the new contract and portioned the breakfast trays with the same accuracy she had always brought to it. And when Mr. Patterson came through the line at 7:15 in his visitor badge and ordered his usual, she had it ready, because she had been saving it for him since 7. The Tuesday after the new contract took effect, Rosie came to the bus shelter at 5:41. She was wearing the red coat, buttoned to the top, and she had the thermos in her bag. Arthur was already there. 2 paper cups from the coffee shop, hot chocolate in both because he had been told by Rosie on the previous Tuesday that he should try it, that soup was for cold days and hot chocolate was for cold days, plus the kind of news that deserved something sweet. He had not asked what kind of news. He had simply ordered 2 hot chocolates. She sat down and looked at the cups and looked at him. Then she reached into her bag and produced the thermos. He took the thermos. She took one of the cups. They sat in the particular quiet that had become, over 3 Tuesdays and 2 Thursdays, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who did not need to fill the space between them. She said, my mom got her new hours letter. He said, I heard. She drank her hot chocolate. He opened the thermos and the smell of the chicken soup came out into the cold air of the shelter, and he poured some into the cup lid which he was using as a bowl. He drank it. She watched him. "Well," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It tastes like someone made it carefully. That's what Mom says about food. She says food knows whether you were paying attention when you made it." He looked at the thermos cup. "I think she's right about that." She told him about the science fair. She had submitted the weather journal, 12 entries over 3 weeks, with hand-drawn cloud diagrams and temperature charts, and her theory about the quality difference between October and November light, which she had expanded into a 2-page analysis with a hypothesis and 3 observations in support of it. Mrs. Hammond had written at the top, "This is the kind of thinking that real scientists do." Arthur said, "What is your hypothesis?" She had the document in her backpack because she had been revising the diagrams. She pulled it out and read the hypothesis aloud. "The difference between October and November light in the upper Midwest is not primarily a function of cloud cover but of the angle of solar incidence combined with atmospheric moisture content, which creates a qualitatively distinct color temperature in November that registers as warmer in wavelength but colder in perceived effect." She looked up at him. He said, "That is an excellent hypothesis." She said, "I haven't proven it yet." Mrs. Hammond says a hypothesis is just a question you've dressed up properly. He said, "Your teacher is correct." The 34 came early again. She stood up and tucked the weather journal back in her bag and held out her hand for the thermos. He gave it back. She put it in her bag. She said, "Did you tell your grandchildren about me?" He said, "I told them about a young lady who knows the bus schedule and who taught me something about paying attention to what is actually in front of you." She received this. "What did they say?" He said, "My granddaughter Nora said she wants to meet you. She is 8 years old and she is interested in constellations." Rosie tilted her head. "Does she know Orion?" He said, "She was the one who first told me about Orion." A small pause. "Do you think she would like me?" He said, "I think you would understand each other completely." The 34 opened its doors. She took a step toward the street and then stopped and turned back. She said, "I'm glad you missed your car that day." He looked at her. "So am I," he said. She went home. He sat in the shelter for a few minutes after the 34 had gone, with the cold and the quiet and the smell of the chicken soup still faintly present. The straightest clouds had broken into sections again, the February light coming through the gaps with the flat, honest quality of late winter in the Midwest, the light that does not flatter anything but shows what is actually there. He thought about the evening in November when he had sat in this same shelter shivering without his coat and a child had stopped on the sidewalk and looked at him with the steady attention of someone deciding what the situation required. He thought about what it had cost her. 1 coat on a cold evening, the arithmetic of it simple and complete. She had given what she had. She had not given it strategically. She had not given it because anyone was watching. He had been watching his whole life for the return on his investments, in the specific, calibrated way of a person who had learned that watching for returns was how you made sure the investment had been real. And a child at a bus shelter had handed him something she needed on a cold afternoon and walked home in a sweater and not looked back. And in doing so had demonstrated a principle he had spent 69 years building frameworks around without fully inhabiting. You give what you have because it is needed. The rest is not your calculation to make. He folded the paper cup and put it in the bin at the shelter entrance and walked back toward Maple Drive in the February light. The announcement of the Millfield Standards Initiative came in March, 3 weeks after the new cafeteria contract had been running without incident and after Robert Alcott had spent 6 weeks with the Mercy Ridge Board refining the terms of the partnership. The initiative was a joint effort between the Whitfield Foundation and Mercy Ridge Health Partners to establish and fund labor standards provisions across all contracted services at all 3 Mercy Ridge facilities, covering food service, environmental services, and patient transport. The provisions included minimum hours guarantees, benefits floors, and pay grade structures. If the pilot held through the following year, the framework would be offered to 5 other regional hospital systems in the state at no cost, on the condition that they adopted equivalent terms in their own contracted services. Arthur did not hold a press event. He made the announcement through a joint release from the foundation and the hospital system, with a quote from Dr. Holloway about the importance of extending the hospital's commitment to care to the people who made care possible. He gave one interview to a reporter from the Millfield Courier who had covered labor issues in the city for 11 years and who asked him at the end of the interview what had made him look at this particular issue at this particular time. He said, "I came back to the city where I grew up and I started paying attention to what was actually in front of me." He paused. "I should have started paying attention earlier. But I didn't, and now I am, and that will have to be sufficient." The reporter asked if there was a specific moment. He said, "There was a conversation at a bus shelter." He did not elaborate further. The reporter printed it as he said it. Several people in Millfield read it and thought about their own bus shelters and their own conversations and what they had done with them. This was not something Arthur had planned. It was simply the way that honest things, said plainly, sometimes spread. Clara read the article at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in March, with Rosie beside her eating cereal and the apartment full of the particular Saturday morning light that came through the kitchen window when the March sun was out and hit the counter at the right angle, warm and specific. She read it twice. She said it on the table. She said, "A conversation at a bus shelter." Rosie looked up from her cereal. Clara looked at her daughter. She said, "You gave him your coat." Rosie said, "He was cold." Clara looked at her for a long moment, at the braids coming undone already at 8:30 in the morning, at the weather journal open beside the cereal bowl because Rosie recorded the morning conditions before she did anything else now, at the yellow lanyard hanging on the hook by the door. She said, "I know, baby. I know he was." She folded the article and put it beside the weather journal. She got up to make coffee. At the window above the sink, she looked out at the alley below and at the March sky above the rooftops, pale blue in the sections where the clouds had opened, the light falling through clean and direct after the long gray months of winter. She thought about the years of managing the numbers in her head in the dark. The credit card debt and the reduced hours and the letter under the door and the insurance renewal date marked in red. She had carried all of it in the practical, stubborn way she had been carrying things since Marcus left, with the genuine conviction that figuring it out was always possible and that the figuring was hers to do. She had not known that the figuring out had company. She had not known that on a Tuesday evening in November, in a bus shelter 11 blocks from where she was standing, something had shifted in the direction of her life because her daughter had done the unremarkable and specific thing she had been raised to do. She had not raised Rosie to be kind because she expected a return on it. She had raised her to be kind because the world required it and because Rosie was the kind of child who understood, without needing to be told explicitly, that your response to other people's difficulty was the most accurate measurement of who you actually were. She had simply tried to show her that, day by day, in the specific choices she made and the way she made them, in the extra lunch portion and the drive to Mrs. Alvarez's appointment and the way she spoke to the people in the cafeteria line who were frightened or tired or far from home. She had not called any of it a lesson. She had just lived it and trusted that Rosie was watching. Rosie had been watching. She turned from the window and looked at her daughter at the kitchen table with the weather journal and the cereal and the braids half undone, already writing the morning's cloud observation in her careful block letters, the sevens with the crossbar, and felt the particular fullness of a moment that does not announce itself but that you recognize, when you are inside it, as exactly what it is. She poured her coffee and sat down. "Tell me about the clouds this morning," she said. Rosie looked up. She tilted her head. "Altocumulus," she said. "The kind that means it's going to be okay." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "Good," she said. "That's the best kind." Arthur flew to Seattle the week after Christmas, as he had told Caroline he would. Thomas drove him to the airport at 5 in the morning, and in the departures lane before Arthur got out, Thomas said, without turning around, "It was a good fall." Arthur looked at the back of his head for a moment. "It was," he said. Thomas said, "Should I have the nursery send the spring catalog to the house?" Arthur said, "Have them send two. I'll give one to Rosie. She'll have opinions." Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, she will." Arthur got out of the car and went to Seattle. Nora was 8 years old, and she had her grandfather's gray eyes and her mother's directness and a quality of seeing things that reminded Arthur, when he was with her for the first hour, of something specific that he could not immediately identify and then, in the second hour, understood was the same quality he had recognized in a bus shelter on a November afternoon. The quality of a child who absorbed everything, who paid attention the way certain people paid attention, not as a performance of intelligence but as a genuine orientation toward the world. They sat on the back porch after dinner on the second evening, the two of them, because Nora wanted to show him Orion, which was visible from the porch on clear nights, the Seattle sky cooperating. She pointed it out. 3 stars in a row for the belt, she said. He's the hunter. I know, Arthur said. She looked at him. Who told you? He said. A young lady in Ohio. She knows the November sky in particular. Nora looked at the stars. What's her name? Rosie, he said. She walks to a bus shelter on Hartley Street on the way home from school, and she knows the schedule of both buses that stop there. Nora was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a child who is deciding whether to ask the question she is actually thinking. Then she said, Is she your friend? Arthur looked at Orion. Yes, he said. She is. Nora looked at the sky for a while longer. Then she said, When we visit, can I meet her? He said, I think she would like that very much. The spring catalog arrived at the Harrington house in late February, 2 copies, as Thomas had arranged. Arthur looked through it on a Saturday morning and put a second one in his coat pocket. On Tuesday afternoon, he was at the bus shelter before 5:30 with 2 hot chocolates, and when Rosie came down Hartley Street and turned into the shelter and sat down and reached into her bag for the thermos, he put the catalog on the bench between them. She looked at it. What's this? A nursery catalog. I'm replanting the back garden this spring. He paused. I thought you might have opinions. She picked it up and looked at the cover, which showed a garden in full bloom, the particular saturated colors of a June garden in a photograph taken at the right hour with the right light. She opened it with the same focus she brought to the weather journal, her finger tracing down the pages, stopping at specific entries, reading the descriptions with the head tilt. After a few minutes she said, This one. She pointed at an entry for a cold climate perennial called winter aconite, small and yellow, one of the first things to come up when the frost breaks. It comes up before everything else, she read from the description. She looked at him. That's the right one to start with. He looked at the page. He said, Why that one? She said, Because it comes first. You want to see something come up. Then everything else doesn't feel so far away. He looked at the catalog entry for a long moment. Then he took out the pen from his coat pocket and circled it. They drank their hot chocolate and the soup, and the February light came through the gaps in the straightest layer and fell on Hartley Street in the flat, honest way of light that shows you exactly what is there. The coin laundry ran on the other side of the street. The pharmacy was open. 2 people stood outside the dollar store having a conversation in the quick, abbreviated way of people finishing a conversation in cold weather. Rosie recorded the cloud type in the margin of her weather journal. Arthur watched the street. She said, after a while, I'm glad you walk on Tuesdays. He said, So am I. She said, My grandma says you can't plan the things that matter. She says they just happen when you're going somewhere else. He looked at her. She is a very intelligent woman. I know, Rosie said. She makes good pierogi too. He almost smiled. Then the smile arrived completely, the full version, the one that had required several weeks and a child at a bus shelter and a legal pad with 3 questions on it and a phone call to Seattle and a nursery catalog to come all the way out. She saw it and looked satisfied in the precise, quiet way of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has seen it happen. The 34 came. She gave him the thermos and took her cup and stood up. She looked at the catalog still on the bench. She said, Keep it. I wrote some things in the margin. He picked it up. She had written, in the margins of 4 pages, specific observations about each plant she had considered. Too slow, wrong color for February. This one would need more sun than the north bed gets. This one is right. He looked at the last note. Next to the winter aconite she had written, Start here. Everything else comes after. He held the catalog and watched her walk away down Hartley Street toward Crescent Avenue with her backpack on both shoulders and her red coat buttoned to the top and her pace quick and purposeful, the pace of a person who knows exactly where she is going and is not wasting any time getting there. She turned the corner and was gone. He sat in the shelter for a while with the catalog and the cold and the ordinary sounds of Hartley Street in the late afternoon around him, and he thought about a November evening that had looked, from the outside, like nothing more than a man sitting in the wrong place without his coat, and a child who had stopped because the situation was obvious and the right response was obvious and she had not needed anything else to proceed. He thought about his grandfather, who had built something by knowing the people who lived near him. He thought about Jean and her garden, and the note she had written him once on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason except that she had been thinking about something true and had wanted to tell him. Pay attention while you're here. He had not been paying attention the way she meant it. He had been paying the other kind of attention, the kind directed at quarterly figures and portfolio returns and the accumulated performance of things he had built, which was real and had its own value but which was not the same as looking at a street and seeing the specific people on it, or sitting in a bus shelter and receiving, as a gift, the full and genuine conversation of a 7-year-old who had noticed that he was cold. He stood up. He put the catalog in his coat pocket. He threw away the cups. He buttoned his coat against the February cold and started walking back toward Maple Drive. On the north side of Crescent Avenue, the yellow brick building sat in the February light with its empty window boxes, the soil dark and waiting. In 4 or 5 weeks the last frost would break and the first things would start to come up through it, the toughest and most persistent things, the ones that had been there all winter underneath, waiting for the right conditions. In the second-floor apartment, Rosie's red coat was on its hook by the door. The weather journal was on the table by the radiator, open to today's entry, the cloud type and the temperature and the notes about the light. On the counter in the kitchen, 2 portions of soup sat in containers labeled clearly in Clara's handwriting. 1 for dinner, 1 for the thermos on Tuesday. And in the bus shelter on Hartley Street, the winter light sat on the metal bench where 2 people had been sitting, and held the warmth of them for a little while, and then gradually, as all warmth does, let it go. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.